So under this figure of against wieder, something of the violence of the breach is named. And this is an indication of a deformalization and denaturalization of the transcendental regime in Husserl's phenomenology, a kind of oblique trace of the influence and interference of the empirical at the heart of the transcendental, a possible contribution to its mutation of the transcendental, and its capacity to be innervated by the force of the empirical. So the question is, however, what price does surprise have to pay for that? Is still its fate to sink into the phenomenological transcendental paradigm? Another option is to embrace a philosophical alternative, which is offered by empiricism, with philosophers like Aristotle, Adam Smith, Charles Sanders Peirce, John Dewey, and also with the Husserl of attention and emotion lectures. We can identify a possible alternative in the philosophical history and the philosophical history of surprise, and how then surprise can be fully itself without being merely reduced to a mere disturbance in the cognitive rational meaning and process. Then and only then would it be possible to bring phenomenology back under the guard of empiricism. In fact, true surprise has features which are the features of otherness, that is, more concretely, of the other, or trauma, miracle, and otherness actually always leaves philosophy out in the cold. So when the I is surprised, better lets herself be surprised, she will no longer be herself. She will let it go, as in meditation, for example. She will expose herself to the fulguration of beauty in art. She will let herself be by abandoning herself in ethical processes. Thus, the other deepens within myself, and surprise becomes a welcome for the new, a surrender to the gift of newness. For all that, surprise doesn't disappear, it sharpens and makes the subject more wakeful, which is not at all the same as destruction or alienation, as it is the case in logic for surprise, or in cognitive processes where perturbation goes hand in hand with an absolute programmation and disappearance of surprise. But here the question we need to ask ourselves is the following. What existential mutations, what pathologies are caused by this tropism towards the logical pole, which is that of our civilization of control, of a self-enclosed individual, also in some forms of pathology as paranoia, and conversely, what brings us to the pole on the other side of otherness, of openness, which might be emblematized, for example, by the Tao in Eastern thoughts, or awakening more generally in art, in meditation and prayer. A similar question concerns collective and historical surprises, whether political, religious, or ecological. They transcend us radically, and as such, they are in no way mere amplifications or additions of individual or interpersonal surprises. So today, I would like to question anew these distinctions between the logic pole, which is without surprise and also alienate surprise, on the one hand, and openness, which brings about the true surprise, which is the surprise of creation. And today, in order to do this, I will turn to the surprise of nature, that is, to nature as a surprise. What does it reveal us? And so I come to my second step. First variation, the surprise of nature and the powerlessness of humans. It is no secret that nature has never ceased to surprise us. We spontaneously have in mind here cataclysms, hurricanes, storms, or scorching drought that affect human life and can have dramatic consequences in terms of survival and destruction. On a wider scale, the growing awareness of the stakes involved in climate collapse, identified as early as the 70s, although not yet recognized at the time, is creating a context of mobilization in favor of the changing our lifestyles and paying greater attention to the world's endangered ecosystems. The overall effect of this awareness of the precariousness of the world around us is to make us more conscious of our own powerlessness as humans. It intensifies our questioning of how and who we are as humans, and one might say it makes us so much more sensitive to surprises considered in their extreme negative valence as disasters. Since nature for millennia has been considered all-powerful, the human being appears, as a contrast, as a poor and failing being, as it is said in German, as a Mangelwesen. This is the classical proposition that is put forward, for example, by the philosopher and anthropologist Helmut Plessner as early as the 60s in the 20th century, which itself originates in the Herderian conception of the human being as an animal without toes and claws, the human being, an animal without toes and claws. In his biological existence, the human being would be heteronomous, characterized by the weakness of her instincts, instinct schwach. As a consequence, we are invited to distinguish between a dominated being, human being, and a dominating nature. But this distinction may also lead us, as a consequence, to reject this subordination of the human being to her instincts and to focus only on her rational power. It is here that appears to my mind the very risk of our separation as human beings from nature, both due to its all power of nature, and to our will as humans to become more powerful thanks to our reason. Against this view, which leads to a rational logic disconnected from the embodied basis of our being, I would prefer to adopt a more measured stance, which is very clearly made by the philosopher Friedrich Engels in his book, The Dialectics of Nature, which was published in 1876. While being careful for the true power of nature, I may welcome its unsurpassable reality. It never ceases to surprise me in its unpredictability. Thus, I also recognize how much we are intrinsically co-participant both in its powerful yet precarious dynamics. I quote here Engels. Let's not be too flattered by our victories over nature. She takes revenge on us for each one of them. The facts remind us at each step that we do not reign over nature like a conqueror reigns over a foreign people, like someone who is outside nature, but that we belong to her with our flesh, our blood, our brain, that we are in her bosom. But the more it will be like this, the more humans will not only feel, but also understand that they are one with nature, and the more this absurd and unnatural idea of an opposition between spirit and matter, man and nature, soul and body will become impossible. End of quote. So rather than making the domestication of human instinctive nature the price to be paid for rational civilizational progress, in a kind of struggle inspired by a disembodied, off-the-ground, abstract, post-enlightenment thinking, I suggest to welcome the true humanity of human beings at the heart of their embodied fragility of living beings aware of their fragility. This is where the openness to surprise lies, that is, the interactive, relational ability both to surprise and to be surprised. So in what follows, I would like to focus on a specific recent and radical experience we all had of how nature has incredibly impacted us as a surprise. I want to talk about the pandemic, the recent pandemic, coronavirus. I take this as a true first-person experience that has the peculiarity of having been lived by millions of human beings during the same period of time, so as to become a true we experience, a first-person experience in the plural. I will take this experience as an emblematic, radical, and recent experience of how nature has generated in us humans a radical surprise in our mostly urban developed world, which have most of the time lost a great dimension of our natural anchorage. So my next step will be the surprise of nature and the fragility of humans. The first month of lockdown from late February to May 2020 in France have been described by many as staggering, strange, unprecedented, surprising. To begin with, I would like to retrace this singular period where nature, in the emblematic form of a viral attack, has confronted us as rarely before with the planetary precariousness of human beings. I take this recent pandemic crisis as an example of the surprises that nature has in store for us, which transcend us radically, overtake us, accusing us of our fundamental powerlessness at the very moment when they are lodged at the most intimate level of our biophysical organization. From this point of view, the surprise of nature could well be a surprise in which the homeostatic scientific logic, which blunts surprise, and the aesthetic, ethical, meditative openness, which enhances surprise, are radically antinomic. How so? First, the lockdown has generated a surprising relationship with time. With the unconquered power of nature within and without us back to the fore, let us note first that our bodies were put to the test. And with the lockdown, we experienced the constraint of the enclosed space of the home, of the oikos in Greek, or oikos, where we are ourselves and among ourselves, unexposed to the gaze of others, where we dwell, oikio. For many, this was the rediscovered experience of an ecology of the intimate space. It is well known that this health crisis has direct ecological groundings and implications, since the emergence of a new virus and its variants with its associated diseases is also linked to the general modifications of the ecosystem all over the world. But I use here the word ecology in its primary sense, as it is well identified with the prefix eco. In Greek, indeed, tracing back to Aristotle in his Politics, eikos, designate the house in the sense of the home, the center, the nourishing living place. Concretely, while locked down at home, I experience this regained place of ecos. It is this matrix sense of political ecology before and more, and before its contemporary sense of committed discourse for the environment that I would have here in mind in what follows. Even if, of course, the lived rediscovered experience of my inner home results in strong connection with a heightened awareness of our environment, of other living beings, and of the climate emergency. So a surprising pandemic time, which is actually a rediscovered space, an ecological home. So what about our eco time? Let me carry on with this first-person narration for a moment. At first, there was some mistrust. This virus couldn't be serious. We did not believe it. At the end of January, 2020, we learned in France of a single case of COVID at the Bichat Hospital in northern Paris. An elderly patient who was put into coma and finally died. But it was a rare case, and we would not be concerned. Then a few weeks later, we were stunned. This virus has reached Italy and was wreaking havoc. Would it reach us? Basically, during all these weeks, we went from surprise to surprise. Our attitude was one of expectation, locked in by refusal to accept, from complete denial, rational rejection of reality, in the way the ordinary surprise model built functions by activating the mechanics of no open expectation, which degenerates into a startle. And then, with the political decision to confine us to lockdown on March 2020, came the brutal becoming aware of a constraint change in the rhythm of our lives. We were no longer going to be able to go out freely. We were going to telework. And as the lockdown settled, its space-time within us, our inner being became acclimatized to this surprising new situation and finally welcomed it. We entered into the aesthetic meditative model of surprise, where the time of open expectation becomes the possible welcome of surprises to come. We began to rediscover another kind of time, one with a more expansive quality. Time without time, pure openness. No appointment, no obligation other than the one I proposed to myself. For me, this time was called Jouvernay. It is the place where I gather every summer, the place where I find myself, the place where I enter into myself, a place where I make solitude. There was this slowing down of time and the deep awareness of a re-anchoring, a true welcome of surprise. And yet, there was also a curious paradox. Just when time was somehow being given back to me and to us 100-fold, the very desire to meditate and to slow down vanished. While the activity of praying or meditating is usually often abandoned on the pretext that I don't have time, when time was there full to the brim, this very desire disappeared. I have elsewhere described it as a contradictory asceticism of liturgy. If I try to make sense of this feeling, which borders on the absurd, what I sense is an inner movement emerging. Could it be that the aesthetic, ethical, meditative model of surprise was itself confused in the face of the surprise of nature, which was so much transcending us that it exhausted our intimacy, our possibility of being self-connected? In any case, this feeling of futility was a strong response to the absolute distress of the situation we were living at the time. It gave me a vague feeling of unprecedented fragility. So much has been written in the media then. This unknown virus, by taking us by surprise as never before, or rarely before, was confronting us with the unique fragility of our humanity. In moments of mourning, violent death, or with the loss of a beloved one, we are confronted with this feeling of the absolute fragility of our being. But each time, it is a fleeting ordeal, settling in for a while before receding in the background of my consciousness, quickly taken over by the interests of everyday life. With the arrival of this unknown virus, the fragility of my being increased tenfold, and the surprise became incessant, quasi-chronic, a feeble echo of a schizophrenic pathological surprise. Except that the fragility was here applied to myself and not experienced by proxy, through the loss of another. Why fragility? Why this word? Why this concept? This word, this concept has been actually scarcely broached in philosophy or in social sciences. Some few thinkers thematized it, like, for example, Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, in 1950 in his book, The Voluntary and the Involuntary, and applied to the heart, saying, I quote, the heart would be the fragile moment per se, unquote. Or the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, also in her book, The Fragility of Goodness, and more recently, the French philosopher Jean-Louis Chrétien, in his last book entitled precisely Fragilité, in 2017. But none of them provide actually a detailed first-person account of this feeling of fragility as being an awareness of my natural bodily disappearance and embrittlement intrinsically embedded into a social, political, and existential we context. So this special social eco-fragility has to my mind a few features, three main features. First, the collective time of these weeks and months of lockdown in France and elsewhere reverberated within me in a prevailing existential mood of dull anguish, of being contaminated without knowing it, and of life suspended, waiting each morning for the emergence of possible symptoms, for example. Second feature, this basic anxiety reactivated each morning with the phrase, no fever, was intensified by the feeling of insecurity caused by the incoherent management of the health crisis by the governments, a feeling of increased instability. Third, during this whole period, there was the ambivalence of my relationship to death, both confrontation and denial, and this ambivalent feeling was intensified by the obscene combination of counting the death every evening in the media with the political refusal of any support for the dyings and their relatives. So I would like to conclude this step with about this chronic and chronicized surprise of nature as being or becoming more and more fragile with a still more focused first-person narration. And to my view, such a first-person focus is also meant to underline an important concern for a radical embodied speech, which is different and contrasted with what would be a rational logic of meaning, as I mentioned it, which raises a surprise. So here is this narration. It is Monday morning, the first Monday in March. I wake up and suddenly I feel something different. All week long, I have been at the bottom of my bed. High fever, exhausting dry cough, respiratory discomfort. Every morning, I watch for the signal. Respiratory worsening. I would go to the hospital. Every morning, I make the same diagnosis. Fever, respiratory congestion. I deny it, I wait, watching for the signs. I feel my body fighting. Fever rising as the day progresses, collapse in the evening. When I woke up on the morning of March 2, something has changed. I get up, inspect myself, and suddenly I understand the fever has broken. I walk around my apartment, checking my condition. My head lighter, my forehead clearer, my eyes more open, and also my rib cage opening up, a childlike pleasure in making it play, in inspire, exhale, and ease and jubilation in simply breathing, a joyful surprise. I simply feel more alive at the very moment when I feel incredibly more fragile. The tension of the body and mind struggle against what will be called this invisible enemy, the virus, is countered by a relaxation that translates into emotional relief, a need to breathe out, literally to exhale, as if after a shock, to fill your rib cage to the brim, to experience the breath, the inhale and exhale. I check that I'm still alive. So surprise of nature inside me, outside me, inside, outside. This feeling of amplified breathing, where the lungs swell and empty. As the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot vividly accounts at the end of a small book testimony in 1944, entitled L'instant de ma mort, the instant of my death, which magnificently echoes this infinite opening of life in death, of death in life. It is all one. I quote Blanchot. The one the Germans were already targeting, waiting only for the final order, then felt an extraordinary feeling of lightness, a kind of bliss, nothing happy though. Sovereign joy, the meeting of death and death. Henceforth, he was linked to death by a surreptitious friendship. At the time when the shooting was just waiting, there remained the feeling of lightness that I could not translate. Freed from life, the infinite that opens, neither happiness nor misfortune, neither the absence of fear, or perhaps already the step beyond. I know, I imagine that this ineffable feeling changed what remained from existence, as if death outside of him could now only collide with death within him. I am alive? No, you are dead. End of quote. I will speak here of fragility. You may have other words to name this feeling of absolute distress, of immersion into a situation where the unpredictable disorients all control. You may prefer to speak of vulnerability, precariousness, or even submission. In all these terms, of course, resonates something of our extreme passivity, of our being affected in a form of undergoing. But I prefer the term fragility because it reflects to my mind the fundamental friable nature of our being, of my being. Fragilis in Latin is that which can be broken, as the philosopher Jean-Louis Chrétien so rightly points out. One who is friable, as the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, I mentioned, also says, who has also become aware of one's own weak spot, whereby there is an active resumption of this passive inclination. I prefer to speak of fragility because this experience seems to me more universal, at least in comparison with the contemporary use of these other terms, which name this extreme passivity, but also designate social or political categories of people. Vulnerable people, as Emmanuel Levinas's case, which are widows, orphans, today the elderly or people with chronic illnesses. Precarious people, or in Hans Jonas's words, for example, the living beings exposed to the risk of death, namely plants and animals, or people who live below the poverty line, or whose occupation exposes to hunger. Submissive people are typically slaves or women in Simone de Beauvoir's acute diagnosis. So fragility seems to me more universal, situated beyond these categories of social and political dimensions. In this context of absolute weakening and embrittlement of our being, even then the usually operative supports of meditation or prayer, as I mentioned, became already meaningless, as if they were still artifacts, formatted windows of time dedicated to finding oneself predetermined for our well-being, as the French sociologist Frédéric Lordon analyzes in the ambiguous goal of mindfulness meditation sessions offered to employees in companies. A pre-formatted time, supposedly of return to oneself, ultimately intended to make productivity at work even more profitable. This new cognitive capitalism seems to be even more insidiously manipulative than the one Karl Marx denounced in the 19th century. In short, the pandemic situation generated distress such that it rendered obscene these dedicated moments for meditation or prayer, abstractly cut off from a continuous daily rhythm, suffused with dull anxiety, worry, insecurity, and instability. These moments, cut off from my spontaneous flowing experience, separated from it, are framed then into a fabricated pre and post meditation. All in all, these cut-off moments tend to reproduce the disconnection that haunts our lives, always on the brink of a kind of, metaphorically, schizophrenic dissociation, one that Gilles Deleuze very early diagnosed as being the very product of capitalism. So hence my last step, finally, with this question: how can we become more living? How nature as surprise can benefit us and create a unique vitalization of our humanity? Why is it, what is it with this acute feeling of absurdity with regard to these tools and sufficiently powerful here to bring about any genuine reconnection, any true, authentic embodiment of my distressed self? What is left? Maybe only the emergency of a different asceticism, as I would say, different from this preformatted pseudo-liturgical space-time, from this technique offered to our biotech minds. Or to put it in another way, the emergency of a deeper epoche, a special suspension, a special break of our imposed preconceptions. The answer would come from a deeper space and place, freeing oneself from predetermined formats, appointed moments, a fortiori from their caricature as our digital sessions of guided meditation, liturgies via Zoom, etc. The answer that comes from a deeper place and space would be a face-to-face encounter with my distressed self and the absurdity of this situation. As a contemporary Russian Orthodox holy monk Silwan says magnificently, hold your spirit in hell and do not despair. End of quote. What makes me then more alive in this hellish apocalyptic situation? More living, as I prefer to say, rather than alive, as we commonly say. Living, this present participle means a process, the process of living, not a state or a being as alive does. To be alive would be only to survive. How can we not be mere survivors who anxiously await the signs of our imminent possible death, separated from ourselves, external to ourselves, separated for our beloved, in the case we are at the hospital, isolated and lonely? How can we be living from within? This feeling of becoming more living, I experience it actually viscerally in the cardiac rhythm and the emotions I provide. Cardially, if I can allow myself this neologism, which refers to the lived fold of the heart and the affective. In this micro moments, my rib cage suddenly takes the air fully into my lungs, swirls spontaneously with the influx of air in a non-dual passive active receptive move. These micro movements express the uncontrolled influx of life in me and emanate from me through my respiratory dynamics, which ceaselessly connects and regenerates the internal and the external. So every inhalation is a surprise from nature, from the air inside me. Every exhalation is a surprise sent to nature outside me in an indefinite circulation of nature's breath. The elementary natural move is then a true and unrobbable becoming more living, It is the very surprise of nature in me. Now, this receptive move echoes precisely, for example, Husserl's conception of receptivity. When I feel this increased influx and inflow of air into my lungs, breathe in, breathe out, close to the involuntary breathing of a newborn, I genuinely am receptive. The spontaneous set into motion of the cardiac rhythm, together with breathing, before any neuronal emergence, was very early formulated by Maurice Merleau-Ponty in his lecture about nature at the Collège de France as a new pre-neural dynamics. At that very early moment of life, the contractions of the cardiac muscle are only responsible alone for the growth of the organism. So I quote Maurice Merleau-Ponty in his lectures about nature. At 9.5 weeks, the principal aspects of the human electrocardiogram area present in the same way as in the adult state. Yet at this date, there is no nervous control of the heart. Geisel, an embryologist, finds here Coghill's ideas, another embryologist that Merleau-Ponty is quoting, and speaks of a dynamic morphogenesis that would envelop the facts integrated or not by the nervous system, unquote. In that respect, as I developed in my own way elsewhere in a cardiophysiological program, the heart is the fragile, vital, key effective organ for the growth of the organism. And it is centrally responsible for the breathing existential dynamics of the human beings. By opening myself to the air flowing in me, I expose myself. More broadly, in a sense, I risk my life at each instant. Because converse concretely with the pandemic, for example, I could also at any moment inhale the virus. These famous droplets would remain in the air. But while risking my life, I win it back. I pass from the status of survival to that of living. I become more alive at the heart of the risk I choose to take. The French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir magnificently expresses this tension by taking the example of Mina de Wangel, Stendhal's heroine, who lives by opening herself up to the unpredictable, to the unforeseeable, surprising dimension of that which she experiences as being the only real of reality. I quote Beauvoir. A passionate and profound woman constantly revises the established values. She knows the constant tension of freedom without support. In this way, she constantly fears in danger. She can at any moment win everything or lose everything. It is this risk assumed in the anxiety that gives its history the colors of a heroic adventure. And the stake is the highest, the very meaning of this existence, which is her only possession. Mina de Wangel's adventure may in some sense seem absurd, but it involves an ethics, unquote. So to conclude, welcoming the surprise of nature, that is, nature as surprise in us as humans, is becoming more living, assuming one's own fragility, one's inner weak and tender spot. It is also risking, it amounts also to risking exposing one's identity and integrity. It finally amounts to showing that fragility is not a weakening of my being. It does not result only in a being more alive, it is more. Fragility is not a mere state, it entails a peculiar microdynamic made of different moves, different phases, from negative to positive, from the alienation of surprise inherent in the logic of rational meaning to the vitalizing process of surprise when becoming more open to oneself. And from one to the other, there is, as a crucial mediation, the becoming aware of my very embrittlement. Research from different fields in immunology, in philosophy, in sociology, for example, clearly show that safe normativity and hypersecurity are fatal to humans. In that respect, for example, Ulrich Beck's pioneer sociological theory of risk is a perfect example of such a diagnosis. By exposing yourself, you immunize yourself. By engaging yourself, you provoke transformation. By transgressing, you surprise yourself. And by doing all this, you no doubt contribute, even modestly, to changing a bit the world and those around you. Thank you for your attention.